Hello everybody, this is Dr. Christopher White, and in this video we're going to be looking at how water can become contaminated. So contaminated water is a very serious issue. It can cause damage to ecosystems, and if the water is going to be used for consumption, it can cause very serious harm to a population. Now, in terms of the contamination of groundwater, in this video we're going to be looking at the contamination of surface water and the contamination of groundwater. On the screen in front of you, you can see a diagram, and this diagram covers some of the main ways in which water contamination can occur. To be clear, these aren't the only ways. There are numerous possible routes for contamination to happen, but in this video, we're just going to focus on a few of the main ones. So we're going to begin by looking at weathering. So weathering is a natural process through which exposed rock reacts with water and oxygen in our atmosphere. And this causes minerals within the rocks to break down. And as those minerals break down, they may release elements into the water supply. Now, in terms of these elements that have entered the water supply, they can then become incorporated into surface waters in the form of rivers or lakes, or they can infiltrate down into the subsurface and eventually become incorporated into the groundwater. Now, some of these elements that are released by weathering are beneficial. Sodium would be a good example of one. Whereas some elements that are released by weathering are not helpful, they are harmful, and a good example of that would be something like arsenic. Now, in terms of the worst types of rock for weathering, we often find that you get higher concentrations of dangerous metals or harmful metals associated with areas that have undergone hydrothermal mineralization. And so these ores in particular will tend to contain concentrations of lead, arsenic, antimony, sulfur, amongst other elements. And so when these rocks weather, they typically release quite a lot of harmful elements into the water. Now, in terms of what we actually see, typically in these areas where you have rocks which are weathering and putting harmful elements into the water supply, you will often see elevated rates, for instance, of things like cancer. And so this is a way of indicating that there are rocks which are weathering, breaking down and releasing harmful elements into the water system, even if you may not be able to see the rocks at the surface. Now, mining is pretty much exactly the same as weathering. So in the case of mining, you find your ore deposit, your mineral deposit, you dig out the ore, you process the ore, and obviously the stuff you want, you take away and you further process it to get the metal that you are looking for. Now, this means, however, you are obviously going to produce a waste material which contains large amounts of the elements and minerals that you do not want. And of course, some of these minerals can be dangerous. So, arsenopyrite is a good example of this. It's a arsenic iron sulfide mineral. It's not really useful for anything, so it would be considered a waste product. And so obviously it would be stored in a pile of waste material, which is produced by mineral processing. So in terms of mining, you will typically end up with a pile of dry waste material, and you will often also have a pond in which you put contaminated water, which has been used as part of the mineral processing system. And of course, in both cases, the pile of waste material and the waste water, it's going to be contaminated, and it will probably contain elevated concentrations of harmful minerals, which will release harmful elements as they break down. Now, when it comes to mining, responsible mining companies will do everything they can to limit the possibility of these metals weathering out of the waste material and entering the water supply. But obviously, less scrupulous mining companies or mining companies that built their facilities many, many decades ago, they are less likely to have the kind of rigorous safety controls in place to stop this kind of contamination happening. Now, another thing that needs to be considered is that even if you aren't looking at weathering, breaking down rock, or mining leading to rock being broken down by weathering, you also have to think about the fact that weathering and mining can sometimes cause harmful minerals to become incorporated into sediment, which will then be transported away from the area, for instance, by rivers. And so weathering and mining can actually lead to contamination being transported into a completely new area, even if that area in question doesn't actually have any harmful rocks located in that region. Okay, so the next possible source is going to be storage tanks and pipelines. So they represent a significant concentration of liquid fuel. So we're looking at gasoline, diesel, kerosene, heating oil, etc. Now, failure of storage tanks or pipelines can cause a rapid release of significant volumes of fuel. So, if a pipeline fails, you are going to get a lot of liquid leaving that pipeline very, very fast. And these fuels can enter the groundwater via infiltration, or they can enter surface waters if they run over the surface. They can find themselves incorporated into lakes and rivers. Now, petroleum products, which includes gasoline, diesel, kerosene, heating oil, etc., contain a range of dangerous organic chemicals. So that includes chemicals like benzene, toluene, and the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And these are chemicals that can enter the groundwater and they can take weeks to break down. And that is sufficient time for them to enter the water supply, for instance, if the water's being consumed, or that's significant, that's enough time to allow plants to obviously take up some of these chemicals and incorporate them into their structures. And of course, if those plants are being used to grow crops, that's a problem. So, in terms of the chemicals which can be released when storage tanks and pipelines fail, the chemicals are linked to increases in rates of cancer, neurological issues, developmental issues, and reproductive problems. So, even though they have a relatively short residence time, so they'll only be in the area for a few weeks before they break down naturally, in that time they can cause significant problems. And if you are dealing with a situation where the leak is persistent, so it's just not being sorted out, then obviously you're going to have these chemicals being persistently in your water supply, and this is going to have very serious implications for the local ecosystem and for any populations that are consuming that water. Now, because these are petroleum based products, typically when they are spilt, they will, if they sink down to the water table, they will often form a layer that sits above the water table. So, in most cases, if you have quite a deep well that draws water from further down below the water table, that water will often have little to no contamination. However, if your well is shallow and is situated around the water table, well, that's more likely to pull this material in, and therefore you will probably be pumping contaminated water out of your well. So, in those kinds of situations, deeper wells will often be somewhat safer than shallow wells. The next possible source of contamination is landfill sites. So, modern landfill sites, which are being built in developed countries, are often engineered to be as impermeable as possible to stop any liquid escaping. And so that means they'll be constructed with layers of clay. You will have impermeable membranes which are put down. You will also build special retaining walls to keep the liquid within each of the landfill cells that make up your landfill site. And there will also be controls about what can go into your landfill. So, why are we doing this? Well, the addition of the clay and the impermeable membranes and the retaining walls, they're designed to keep in what's referred to as the leachate. And leachate is the chemical soup that's produced as the garbage within your landfill cell breaks down. Now, in terms of the controls on what's going into your landfill cell, well, you want to try and make sure that dangerous chemicals are not being dumped into your landfill cell. They have to go and be disposed of safely somewhere else. So, what you really want is you want your landfill cell to just have, things like household garbage in them, which are less likely to contain, highly dangerous chemical constituents. Now, the problem comes when you have historic landfill sites, so those ones which are maybe built decades ago, or you have landfills which are being constructed in developing nations, because they will often not be built to the same standard. So they may not have any kind of impermeable layer built into them to stop that leachate escaping. Another problem that you have is that historic landfill sites in developing nations do often not have any kind of control on what's being dumped into the landfill. So in all cases, you obviously expect your landfill to, have quite a lot of household waste. That's perfectly normal. But in these historic landfills and landfills in developing nations, you may also have the addition of industrial chemicals being dumped into the landfill. petroleum products, so lubricants and tires, for instance. You may have car and household batteries being dumped into your landfill. You may have fluorescent light bulbs, which contain mercury, being dumped into your landfill. And so, in a normal modern landfill site, you would want those kinds of dangerous materials dealt with somewhere else or put into a special landfill, which is even more, even more robustly engineered. Uh, so the fact that in these historic landfills and in landfills in developing nations, you don't have these controls, it means that the leachate that's produced by your landfill is more likely to contain very harmful chemicals, which can obviously then exit your landfill and enter the surface water supply or the groundwater. Now, when it comes to modern landfills, which are being built in developed nations, they will also build in a system of pipes towards the bottom of your landfill cell. And these pipes are actually designed to collect the leachate. So, this is another way that you try and stop that leachate escaping and causing contamination somewhere else. And of course, that leachate, once it's collected, can then be taken somewhere else and it can be treated to try and remove any dangerous stuff from it. Now, once again, when it comes to historic landfill sites and landfill sites which are being built in developing nations, this system of pipes is often not present. And so this means that the leachate within each landfill cell can build up over time, and if the landfill cell fails, well, then that leachate can come pouring out. So, in terms of leachate itself, it can contain a range of chemicals. So, you can have toxic organic compounds, you can have heavy metals like lead, mercury, and arsenic. You can have microplastics, sulfur compounds, and various other organic chemicals. And so, there is a lot of bad stuff in this leachate. And some of the elements, like mercury, for instance, have residence times which go on in years. So, if they contaminate your local water supply, that contamination is not going to disappear quickly. It's going to be around for a very long time. Now, in terms of how this leachate manages to escape your landfill, well, sometimes it's just purely that the landfill site has not been built to a high enough standard. There may not be an impermeable layer to stop that leachate escaping. And so, if there's nothing to stop it escaping, it will escape into the surrounding water supply. You can also have situations where, even if you have an impermeable layer, that impermeable layer can crack. Or maybe that impermeable layer can fail due to erosion. So let's say your landfill site is built near a river. As your river moves laterally, it eventually ends up eroding into the side of your landfill, and that allows the leachate to escape into the river. And so once your leachate has escaped, it can obviously then enter the surface supply, rivers or lakes, or it can infiltrate down into the soil and become incorporated into the groundwater. And once again, this leachate contains a whole range of very nasty stuff which you don't want in your water supply. So that's a whole range of chemicals and also sometimes bacteria as well. And so the implications for any local populations nearby, if the water supply does become contaminated with landfill leachate, are very, very serious. Okay, so the next possible source is going to be septic systems and open sewers. So this is a relatively common source of contamination from human waste. So, septic systems, for those people that aren't really familiar with them, are essentially self-contained tanks, which are designed to be used by individual houses to essentially store and treat wastewater. So, we're talking about water that comes out of your washing machine, your dishwasher, your sink, and your toilet. So, they are typically installed in areas where municipal wastewater removal is not possible. And so, if you think about Texas, absolutely huge state, there's only a few areas where municipal wastewater supply collection is possible. And so, in the areas where it's not, you have to put in a septic system for your house to treat any waste water that you produce. Now, an unmaintained septic system will eventually become full, and this will lead to the septic system leaking into the surrounding area. And you can also have a situation where, even if your septic system is working correctly, it can release untreated water if you are not following the correct protocol. So, most septic systems require you to put in bleach, which is combined with any wastewater which is released in order to, decontaminate it. But if you're not putting that bleach in, obviously any wastewater that's released can contain dangerous microbes or dangerous chemicals. And so a poorly maintained septic system can lead to contamination of the area around a property. Now, this might not sound too bad until you think, well, there is the possibility that your property could be built somewhere near a body of water, like a lake or a river, and so you could end up contaminating that surface water. Now, we also have another situation where you can end up with a much larger scale release of wastewater into lakes, rivers, and on occasions the sea. And this can be from water treatment plants. So these are the municipal facilities which are used to treat wastewater so that it can be safely put back into the environment, or maybe in some cases reused. Now, in the event that there is a very heavy rainstorm, you can end up with a lot of wastewater entering your water treatment facility in a very short period of time. And in that situation, the only possible thing to do to stop your facility getting damaged is to release the wastewater. And so you will release this wastewater into rivers, lakes, and seas. And this is a particularly serious problem in the United Kingdom right now, where the water infrastructure hasn't really been updated for quite a long time. And so when there's heavy rain, these water treatment plants get overwhelmed by the volume of water. And so they have to release it into local rivers, for instance. And it's led to outbreaks of waterborne diseases, which have affected things like triathlons and rowing events, and just people that want to swim in rivers. Now, when it comes to open sewers, these are more often found in developing nations, and they can contain a mixture of human waste, animal waste, and household refuse. And because they're not sealed, this allows contamination to enter surface water. So, as water runs down through this open sewer, it's going to pick up a whole range of different chemicals and bacteria, and that contaminated water can now either infiltrate the soil and go down to the groundwater, or it can get washed into local rivers and lakes. So, in terms of human and home waste, it can obviously contain a whole range of chemicals that have long retention times. You can have organic compounds from things like detergents. You can have various chemicals from household cleaners. And obviously, you can have contamination from medications, because the wastewater that your body produces will contain some amount of medications that you are taking. And obviously, this too will enter the contaminated water that your household produces. And so, poorly maintained septic systems, water treatment facilities that aren't designed to deal with large influxes of water, and open sewers are a very common way of causing water contamination. Especially in areas which are very built up. So you have a lot of people in a relatively small area. In that situation, the open sewers, for instance, in those kinds of environments, can become extremely contaminated and lead to groundwater and surface water contamination, which is very, very serious for the local population. So, next possible source is going to be farming and ranching. And farming and ranching produces significant amounts of contaminated water, and this is going to be in the form of surface runoff in most cases. So, when you think of farming, they use a whole range of chemicals. So, there's fertilizers, insecticides, herbicides to kill weeds, and you're also going to, in some cases, use chemicals called defoliants to get rid of leaves. So, for instance, in cotton farming, you're going to want to use a defoliant to get rid of the leaves so that you can get to the cotton more easily. Now, these are all chemicals, and they will be liberally sprayed onto the field in order to deal with, pests, weeds, any leaves that you want gotten rid of, and fertilizers to actually help the plants grow. Now, some of these chemicals will obviously be taken up by your plants, but a lot of them will end up becoming incorporated into surface runoff. So let's say it rains, the water is moving across your field. As the water moves across your field, it obviously starts to pick up these chemicals. Another problem that you have is that if you are using a situation where you have a field that's being actively irrigated, as you are releasing water as part of your irrigation system, that water begins to evaporate away. And so, as that water begins to evaporate away, it will release small amounts of salts. And so over time, because your irrigation system is constantly running, you can end up making your soil saltier, saltier, and saltier, which obviously is bad for the plants. And so later on, what can happen is you can have a rainstorm come through. That rainstorm dissolves a lot of that salt, and once again, it transports it out. So when it comes to farming, when you have excess water moving over your farmed area, it can collect a whole range of chemicals and salts. And obviously, all of this contaminated water, it can enter surface water supplies or it can enter the groundwater. And this is particularly common because in a lot of cases, the wastewater that's coming off your fields will typically go into an unlined drainage ditch, and that drainage ditch will then often empty into a local body of water. So there's not really any treatment going on for the wastewater, it's just being dumped straight into the local water supply. Now, you also have the situation where you are dealing with animals. And so, in the case of water, it's going to interact with animal waste. Obviously, you are going to have a decomposition process taking place. So, the water that interacts with this animal waste, it can contain harmful bacteria, it can contain hormones that have been used to treat the animals, and it can contain additives from any feeds that the animals have been consuming. And so, once again, you have a situation where all of this wastewater is just being essentially washed out of the animal pens. It goes down a drain, typically into a drainage ditch, and that drainage ditch will then empty into some kind of nearby body of water. Now, this is obviously very, very bad. So, contaminated water can enter rivers, lakes, and some of it will even infiltrate down into the groundwater. And so, in cases where that happens, it can lead to local water, which would be used for consumption, becoming unconsumable. You can't drink it. Another problem that you get, especially with the release of fertilizers into bodies of water, is that it actually encourages algae to grow because the water is now richer in the chemicals that algae, which is a plant, needs to grow. And so what happens is you end up building up these huge algal mats in lakes and in slower flowing rivers. And what they will do is, number one, they will damage the existing ecosystem, so they'll block sunlight getting to other plants, and that will cause the aquatic plant life to essentially die off, which is bad for the animals that live in your river. But another problem is that because you have all of this algae, well, that algae is going to die. And so when it dies, the bodies of the algae are going to obviously settle into the bottom of your lake or into the bottom of your slow flowing river. And the decomposition of all that organic material is going to lead to the production, or should I say, the use of oxygen within your body of water, be it a lake or a river. And so this can lead to reduced oxygen levels in your body of water, which will obviously then again damage your ecosystem. So that's going to lead, for instance, to fish dying off. And in some extreme cases, you can end up with bodies of water becoming nearly completely oxygen free. And in that situation, the types of bacteria that become active are bacteria that use sulfur compounds in order to break down organic material. And so what will happen is you're, instead of releasing carbon dioxide as a byproduct or of decomposition, you will end up releasing sulfur compounds instead. And so this will lead to your body of water becoming contaminated. The sulfur compounds will react with water to produce sulfuric acid, so the pH will get lower, so it will become more acidic. And you'll also have a very strong smell coming from your body of water because all these sulfur compounds are going to give you that kind of rotten egg smell that you associate with sulfur compounds. And so farming and ranching can be very damaging to water supplies. Now, luckily, farmers are quite responsible and they will often do their best to try and limit the amount of surface runoff that's going into local bodies of water. So they may use retaining ponds, for instance, to try and slow down the rate with which wastewater is entering local bodies of water. And so this is obviously going to be helpful. But if you are dealing with a situation where there is no controls on what happens to that wastewater, you can end up having a very serious problem. So the next possible source of contaminations are fuel spills. And these are associated with gas stations primarily, but obviously you can also get them occurring when you have some kind of accident, for instance, an oil tanker spilling its load. Now, in most cases, isolated spills, so for instance from a truck accident, will often have a relatively limited effect. So the accident happens, the fuel gets spilt, some of it will get cleaned up, some of it may enter local water supplies, some of it may enter the soil and start moving towards the groundwater, but the residence time of the dangerous chemicals which are released tends to be over a period of a few weeks before they break down. And so, in that situation, yes, it is damaging, but the harm that it causes is relatively limited because it was a one off event. Now, when it comes to leaks in gas stations, that's somewhat different. So, it's not uncommon for the storage tanks underneath a gas station to develop leaks over time. And to start with, these leaks can simply go undetected. The owner of the gas station may not even realize that their tank is leaking. You can also have a situation where the owner does know that the tank is leaking. However, the actual removal and replacement of a tank is an extremely expensive undertaking because obviously you have to dispose of the old tank, which is contaminated, so it's got to be disposed of at a special facility. You have to buy the new tank, which you have to install, and obviously, while that entire process is going on, your gas station is shut down, so you're losing money because you're not able to sell gas. And so, if you happen to be dealing with an unscrupulous owner, they may decide that it's just better to keep the leaking gas tank in the gas tank in the ground rather than digging it up and replacing it. And so, in either case, if you are, if you just don't know there's a leak, or if you are being unscrupulous, this can lead to a significant amount of gasoline leaking out of the tank into the surrounding soil. And obviously, that will then start to infiltrate downwards towards your water table. Now, in terms of the leaked fuel from gas station storage tanks and surface spills, which can also occur around petrol pumps, this will infiltrate down through the soil into your water table. And obviously, as we've previously discussed, because it's a petroleum product, it will tend to float at the top of the water table. And so, if you happen to have a shallow well that just touches the top of the water table, when you're drawing water, it will be more likely to pull in that contamination. Deeper wells will tend to be less likely to be contaminated. Now, in terms of gasoline and diesel, which is the stuff that's primarily being released, it contains a range of cancer causing organic chemicals. So, these are going to obviously have very serious health implications. And because this is a persistent leak, it's not going away. This means that there will be a supply of these dangerous chemicals into the groundwater over a very prolonged period. So, it can cause very serious harm to the local population. You also have a situation from old, now defunct gas stations that used to sell leaded gasoline. Well, of course, when you had leaded gasoline, if that gasoline leaked out into the surrounding soil, it would leave lead behind, and lead has quite a high residence time. It doesn't go away easily. And so that means that the ground surrounding that old petrol station, gas station, can be extremely heavily contaminated with lead. So the next thing I'm going to think about is manufacturing. Now, manufacturing products requires a huge array of materials in order to make stuff that we buy. So it's going to include metals, plastics, petroleum products, fuels, chemicals. There's a whole range of materials that's used which can lead to contamination. So obviously there's too many, things to look at in just one slide. So we're just going to focus on plastic. So, plastic manufacturing can be extremely polluting. So, plastic manufacturing uses something which is referred to as naphtha, and this is produced by the cracking of crude oil. So, it's one of the products that's produced when you process crude oil to get out, other chemicals, to get out, certain different types of hydrocarbons. Now, once you have the naphtha, what you have to do is you have to polymerize it, and that is used to produce what's referred to as a plastic resin. And then once you produce your plastic resin, you can then further refine it using certain chemicals in order to produce plastic products that have, for instance, individual colors, certain hardnesses, certain sheens to the product. And so that's a whole lot of chemicals which are being used. And so you have a situation where you can actually end up with the chemicals themselves being accidentally released from storage tanks, or you can have a situation where water, which is used as part of the processing, can become contaminated, and that too can be accidentally released as well. And so this means that manufacturing can produce a whole range of very toxic byproduct, waste products that can enter the local water supply. Now, another issue with manufacturing is if that manufacturing uses coal as a energy source. So, when it comes to the burning of coal, it will produce a material which is referred to as fly ash. And fly ash is it's a fine powder produced by the combustion of coal. And the fly ash contains a range of heavy metals, including metals like lead, mercury, cadmium, chromium, and arsenic. These are all metals which will cause harm to people if consumed. So the fly ash can then settle into local rivers and local bodies of water, and it can also become incorporated into sediments. And so this will then allow the fly ash to either pollute local water supplies, or it can lead to the fly ash that becomes incorporated into the soils, for instance, to slowly break down and release those metals so that they can then get transported down and become incorporated into the groundwater. So it's not only the chemicals that are used to produce and manufacture the products that we want, it's also the source of the energy that can cause water pollution. So over time, because most manufacturing facilities will be at a location for an extended period, we're talking decades. So over the life of your facility, and this even includes recycling facilities, which also use a whole range of chemicals in order to recycle products, you can have a consistent release of contamination into the surrounding area. And so this can lead to the area surrounding your manufacturing facility to become extremely heavily contaminated. And of course, over time, this contamination will enter the surface water and it will enter the groundwater. But because the soil is so contaminated, it means that even if you close your manufacturing facility down, the contamination could still remain in that area for decades. And so, very often, when you have to treat one of these old manufacturing facilities, you often have to strip off a whole load of the soil, which underlays your manufacturing facility, and transport that away and dispose of it in specialist disposal facilities. So the next thing we're going to think about is contamination that is actually being transported into a new area. And this transportation of contamination into an area can occur by rivers or it can occur through the groundwater. So if you have a river that is draining through a contaminated area, obviously that river can then pick up that pollution and it can transport it downstream. So even if your area doesn't actually have any possible source of contamination, you still may not be safe. It may just be transported in from somewhere else. So the contamination could come from direct sources. So it could simply be people dumping chemicals straight into the river, or it could be through the interaction of water with contaminated material, like polluted soil around manufacturing facilities. So once you have contaminated your surface water, obviously the river will then transport it downstream, where it can become incorporated into other rivers or lakes. And also, in the event that your river happens to be a losing stream, well, obviously, some of the water from your river can then sink down into the unsaturated zone, and eventually it will make its way down to the groundwater as well. So, transporting contamination in is actually very, very common because typically, people who are dumping waste without thinking, they work under the assumption that, well, the waste is going to be transported away. It's not my problem anymore, but it becomes someone else's problem further downstream. Now, in terms of contaminated groundwater, you can have groundwater that has been polluted directly due to human activity, or you can have groundwater that's actually being polluted due to geologic setting. So, in terms of polluted groundwater, this is the kind of stuff we've been talking about. Contamination happens at the surface, the contaminated water infiltrates down, and that contaminated water becomes incorporated into the groundwater. Now, you can even have, in some very extreme cases, manufacturing facilities using things which are referred to as disposal wells, and these were and are wells which were drilled near manufacturing facilities, and they were specifically designed to allow companies to pump their waste products down into the groundwater so that they could be transported away. Of course, in retrospect, that's a very, very bad idea. And so, contamination of groundwater can occur from a number of human activities, and obviously that can then be transported to a new location through groundwater flow. Now, in terms of geology, you may have a situation where as your groundwater is flowing, it's going to interact with a unit of rock or sediment that contains minerals that have metallic elements in them. And of course, the passage of the water through that layer of material will maybe cause those minerals to break down, releasing harmful elements into the groundwater. Now, in that situation, because you don't really know that harmful layer of rock is there, contaminating your groundwater, you may not realize the contamination is happening until much later. And then what will happen is you'll notice there's some kind of health issue in your area, like maybe a higher rate of cancer or maybe a higher rate of neurological issues in an area, at which point you can then go in and say, right, the groundwater's contaminated and it's being contaminated by this layer of rock releasing heavy metals into the groundwater supply. So, the final source of contamination we're going to look at are small businesses and residential use. So, in terms of small businesses, a dry cleaners is a classic example of a possible business that could lead to the release of dangerous chemicals into the water supply. And that's because a lot of these small businesses use specialist chemicals. And you have to remember that the number of small businesses is considerably higher than the number of really large manufacturing sites. And so the combined effect of small businesses is actually greater than large manufacturing facilities. So, a good example of the kinds of chemicals that are being used, if we go back to dry cleaning. So, dry cleaners don't use water. So, instead, what they're doing is they are treating items of clothing using organic solvents. And obviously, once those organic solvents have been used to clean an item of clothing, they have to be disposed of. And these organic solvents can include chemicals like perchloroethylene, PCEs, and these, for instance, are carcinogenic, so they're cancer causing, and they're also a neurotoxin, and so they must be disposed of safely. And the vast majority of small business owners will dispose of them safely. However, of course, in all situations, you are going to have countries where maybe the disposal rules are quite weak, or you're going to have a situation where you have an unscrupulous business owner. And so, because smaller businesses tend to be less well monitored than very large manufacturing facilities, and they often operate on finer margins, so the cost of disposing of chemicals safely, can cause a very serious hit to their bottom line. You can end up with a situation where small business owners will simply dispose of their chemicals in an unsafe way, which can then allow them to enter the water supply. Now, in terms of residential pollution, it comes in two main ways. The first way is actually the building of the house itself. So, obviously, in order to build your house, you're going to need building materials, and a lot of these will be treated in order to survive surface exposure to the elements. And so, when you think of something like maybe the production of materials like MDF, medium density fiberboard, this will, require a whole range of polluting chemicals to be used to, protect that material and produce that material. Think of lumber that's been pressure treated in order to, reduce damage from exposure to the elements and from insects. Once again, it's a whole range of dangerous chemicals which are being used to produce that treated lumber. And so, obviously, as part of that process of making them, you are going to produce waste products, and some of those waste products could, in theory, escape and contaminate local bodies of water. Now, then when it actually comes to building your house, so the house construction portion, you are going to be using a range of chemicals. So you're going to be using stains, varnishes, paints, resins, and once again, it's not going to be particularly well monitored. And so if you have a very large building project, let's say you're building a whole community, the combined effect of all of these chemicals getting spilt during the home building process can actually lead to the area becoming somewhat contaminated. Now, in terms of the day-to-day household activities, they can cause contamination through things like changing your car oil and not disposing of it properly, fertilizing your lawn, just like farming. When it rains, some of the chemicals from that fertilizer will simply be washed off your lawn and into nearby drains. Same goes for insecticides. So there's also a whole range of residential chemicals which can be used in houses as well. The kind of stuff that you use to clean your bathroom or maybe clean your deck at the back of your house, for instance. So the other problem is that these residential areas often have little to no monitoring. And so, if you have a situation where someone is really not behaving themselves, it can lead to contamination of the surrounding area, which will go unreported for a very long time until the contamination has gotten to the point that it's so serious that it can no longer be ignored. Okay, thank you for watching.